All right, ladies and gentlemen, please get your seats. We're going to get started with our next panel on state capture, best practices, and our moderator is Charles Davidson, publisher of The American Interest.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I don't think this is really about the best practices for state capture. I think we've had enough excitement this afternoon, and we might avoid that one. But we have a very distinguished panel here. And at the last minute, Mr. Pomyanovsky showed up, so we are complete. We're all here. To my left, we have Daria Kalenyuk of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine. We have then Mr. Jerzy Pomyanovsky of the European Endowment for Democracy, Mr. Vladislav Ravshokan, now with the IMF, David Salvo of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, and Brian Whitmore of the Center for European Policy Analysis. I'm Charles Davidson, the publisher of the American Interest magazine, and this is a great honor to be here and to moderate this distinguished panel, and I'd like to thank Nino, David, and Kurt for organizing this and inviting me. I have great admiration for all three of them. And I'm also rather fond of all three of them, so it's a great pleasure to be here. This is my second time here. I have already budgeted a lot of time in the gym to recover from a few days here, but it's always wonderful to come here. And I think the day, what's happened today, certainly has validated the importance of this event. And I really salute Nino in the way she's carried this along over the years. So we are going to, I haven't been given specific instructions as to exactly how much time we have. So we still have an hour. Oh, fantastic. All right. Marvelous. Okay, so we don't have to, we can be long-winded, purposefully verbose and dull then. That sounds great. So each of the panelists is going to speak quite briefly. This subject of state capture has come up starting with the beginning of this conference, so it appears to be on people's minds a little bit. I personally, of course, am in favor of state capture. I mean, the American Revolution was an exercise in state capture, after all, as was the peaceful creation of the Third Republic in France, and since then, peaceful democracy, for the most part, has endured there. So presumably, we're not talking about that. We're talking about state capture, with capture being a very pejorative term. And this is, there's some implications, of course, as to what may be going on in this country, but I would venture that this is a global phenomenon, and while I'm not supposed to be a panelist here, I'll sort of leave it at that. I think we may get to that later, and we may get to it in the questions later on. So let's get into things, and we have two Ukrainians, so they're going to be our bookends. We'll start with one Ukrainian and end with the other, and the rest of us will fill in between. So let's start with Vladislav Rashkovan of the IMF, who is going to give us his elevator overview of the question in 5 floors of a relatively moderately paced elevator.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks to Ambassador Walker and to Nina for inviting. You know, I speak on like 10 conferences per annum, but usually it's with boring central bankers and ministers of finance. And here I see it's a very fascinating discussion on democracy issues. And, but before we start discussing on the topic, I think we need to define what state capture is, because I think we may have different opinions about that. So for me, the state capture is a type of systemic political corruption in which someone's interests significantly influence the state decision-making processes to their own advantage. And when we speak whose interests are they, I think there are at least 3 groups. The first is the local oligarchs who have the control of the media, they have access to wealth, the finances, and engage in politics. The second is local bureaucrats or state officials. But the third also, it could be the foreign states who can try to tend to to capture our states or undermine our developments. Ukraine so far is captured by the oligarchs, and the oligarchs stay in the center of so-named, as I name it, system from the capital letter S, which has like 7 elements. And if we have time later, I will be able maybe to tell what it is. But in fact, the corruption, the political corruption, is in the center of this on this system, which makes it alive. And this is where the Kremlin and the local oligarchs have the common goals. As a part of their foreign policy, Russia interested in keeping the corruption in our countries alive. And corruption is a very pleasant environment for Kremlin, because using comparatively low amounts of money for them, they can influence our countries and undermine our development. Nina asked the question, now what? And I don't want this question to be rhetoric or not answered. In the financial world, there is such a framework which is named Washington Consensus, which was developed in the end of 70s, and this informally summarizes how the IMF and World Bank deal with economic problems of the emerging economies. And so I think to address the issue of the state capture and to fight with homo corruptio, we need to develop some kind of Tbilisi consensus. And I have in mind at least the 6 elements of this framework. First, the Ambassador Walker, during the first dinner, he properly said that our countries need to do a homework. And I fully agree, because first we need to have a national unity that the corruption is a problem and this is a priority. Believe me, it's not the case everywhere. Second is we also need to bring the international support. And I like the idea which was today discussed to create some kind of platform between Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia to share our experience on fighting corruption. And I'm looking for who can initiate this platform as a part of Eastern Partnership program. Third, the corruption has a name. And behind any state capture activities, there is a name of some either oligarch or the government official. And here, the West also should do their work. And the US have very powerful tools to control the dollar-denominated transactions of the banks and their customers. And the Europeans and UK regulators also should do more in order to avoid the cases like we had $1 billion laundromat in Moldova, or $5.5 billion stealing money from Ukrainian private bank, or the issues with 250 billion euro going through Estonian branch of one Scandinavian bank. And therefore, the anti-money laundering activities should definitely be expanded. West also has visa restriction policies for people who are engaged in corruption. So I think this should be used more often. Oligarchs media and state media, they also produced a lot of the fake news and fabricated information. And again, more coordinated efforts on the international level to be done. And here yesterday was discussed this issue, but I think we need to do also more. And the last, IMF is also involved in that. And in 2018, IMF developed the more extended framework to fight corruption and to use it in our programs and the surveillance. And Ukraine was one of the pilots, which helped also to build the institutions, who helped also with Daria to build the institutions in Ukraine. And many of them are pretty successful. These activities perceived as a fund as successful. And therefore, in the new program in Ukraine, we will try to address the issues of monopolies and anti-oligarchic actions. And if we are successful, this experience may be used also by other countries. So to summarize this, I think successful fighting with the corruption in our countries, we make Kremlin weaker and our countries better. So it's worth to try, and let's agree on the new Tbilisi consensus.
Fabulous. Thank you, Vlad. Jersey? If you're not ready, we can skip to someone else. Yes.
Absolutely ready. We didn't come to the... That's good, because I was not talking important things so far. Yes, I'm ready, and thank you very much for invitation. Thank you for organizers, McKinney Institute and PCR, and Nino, especially for this excellent conference in this wonderful place. Sorry for my voice, I lost it because of the changes of temperature, flying different part of the Europe last 3 days. Nevertheless, for me specifically, this subject is extremely interesting because I spent many years being part of the Polish National Administration. Now, for many years, I support democracy in different countries, basically supporting independent media, anti-corruption initiatives, as well as supporting civil society that really cares about situation in their countries. I think Vladislav has presented core elements of definition for state capture. I would, in my first intervention, just touch a few points that I think are very important if we ask ourselves what are the first signs of state capture. And let me identify just a few. First sign is when you see that the center of government is not at that place where it should be, where the Constitution decides. So where you can see it, you can feel it, you can, without big effort, understand that the decisions are not taken by president, the decisions are not taken in the parliamentary committees, that decisions are not taken in a specific government bodies, but somewhere else. And how you can judge this? Just taking example that actually Vladislav told me yesterday, and I think is very useful. How many recently regulations are voted by the new parliament in Ukraine? 180. That gives 56 seconds per each one, because they were voted basically within 1 day, as far as I remember. And they were all coming from the President Zelensky. I'm pretty sure President Zelensky wouldn't know even half of them. So they have been prepared somewhere else. So the center of government, from this very first side, at this moment for me, is somewhere else. Where? It's up to political analysts to discuss, but definitely I see this first signal that maybe something needs to be improved. Second is when you see the cooperation between state agency is going too smooth. The nature of the cooperation between agencies in a well-functioning government is that they have to control each other. They have different roles: police, prosecution, judiciary system, but also many other institutions that are part of the system. If the cooperation is too smooth, that means they are actually a vertical structure that is not meant to control each other or influence each other, but they are only taking care of smooth cooperation. I would say too smooth. It's very difficult to define, but you can also sense it well. And the third element is, of course, selection of the different people for different positions. And when you see this natural tendency in state capturing processes where loyalty is much more important than the competence, then you also know that things are not moving into good direction. So I will stop identifying these three important signs that something goes wrong.
Well, thank you. I think that's fabulous. Let's move to Brian.
Apparently not. Yes, there we go. Thank you, Charles. I'm going to talk about state capture in the way I understand it in the current geopolitical context, and that is that it takes place in the context of a broader normative systemic conflict that is going on right now in the world. On one side of that conflict, we have liberal democracy, which is based on institutions, accountability, transparency. But on the other side, we have an equally coherent system. We have what the emigre Russian political scientist Elena Ledeneva calls systema. Systema. And systema is not based on institutions. It's based on informal rule. It's based on patron-client relationships. It's based on networks of influence, and it results in arbitrary rule. Okay? In the liberal democratic system, a contract is sacred. In Sistema, a contract is enforceable to the extent that your krisha is stronger than the other party's krisha. And these two systems are actually fighting with each other right now in the world. It's a battle of governance. Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova happen to be the front lines of that conflict. So this is one way I understand the context in which state capture takes place. Now, state capture itself, which I think Vladislav very accurately described, is the end stage of a geopolitical strategy by Sistema. It begins with malign influence through corrupt transactional networks that are often also transnational networks. But you have this in the Federal Republic of Germany right now. But I don't think the Federal Republic of Germany risks state capture. You have this in many European countries. I witnessed it in my time in the Czech Republic, for example. I believe we have it in the United States. So this is one stage of this. This can progress to a second stage. And that is using these networks of influence to disrupt normal democratic process through chaos. And we're beginning to see this evolve in various Western countries that I don't think I need to name. Finally, we have the capture of legislative, executive, and judicial branches by oligarchic interests tied to Sistema. And I think we're beginning to see some of the stages of this in some of the countries that are Russia's neighbors right now, and we're beginning to see some signs of it right now in the country we all happen to be guests in, and this worries me greatly. The third point I want to make is that countering this and preventing state capture and countering the earlier stages of these malign influence operations, from simply the existence of networks of influence to the disruption of normal democratic governance through chaos, all the way up to state capture, something we see in the West to some degree and something we see in Russia's neighbors to a much greater degree, requires a comprehensive policy doctrine. We need to look at this as a national security issue. And we need to look at, and this needs to be the big buzz phrase now is whole of government approach, so I'll say it again, but it does take a whole of government approach. I would advocate, for example, that we think of things like NATO having ministerials, including finance ministries and interior ministries, as well as defense and foreign ministries. Or you create a non-kinetic NATO to coordinate this. The other thing I would say is that we have to protect the front line. We have to protect Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. I think John Herbst said it in the earlier panel on Ukraine, that the battle in Ukraine is as much about us as it is about the Ukrainians. This is true as far as the kinetic war goes, but it also is true in the non-kinetic war and the attempts by the Russian Federation at state capture. What is going on in Georgia is about us. If we stop this here, it will not spread farther toward us. So this is something I think we have to take very, very seriously. I'm fond of saying corruption is a national security issue. In fact, corruption is the new communism. And we have to treat it that way and prevent it from spreading. Our national security strategy has to be as much about banks as it is about tanks. And this means cleaning up our own houses. When we tell the Ukrainians they need to do more about corruption, I think we have to do more about not enabling corruption in Ukraine. And in this sense, we're all Ukrainians. And I can go into greater detail about these, but I'd rather probably save that for the Q&A or for maybe a later round of questioning. So I'll pass it back to you, Charles.
Terrific. Thanks, Brian. David?
Thanks very much, Charles. And let me echo everyone's thanks to EPRC and the McCain Institute for their overwhelming hospitality. I know we expect a certain level of generosity in Georgia, but this has truly exceeded all expectations, so thank you. We've heard a lot the last 2 days about the need to marry up values and democracy again, and that the West, as Brian just said, has its own housekeeping to do. And that's particularly true for issues regarding state capture. And I know the title of this panel is State Capture: Best Practices. I'm going to highlight some of the worst practices. and not just in developing democracies like Georgia and Ukraine, but in the developed democracies throughout the West. Because there really is this culture of permissiveness of ill-gotten foreign capital to enter our political and financial systems that inevitably corrupts us just as it corrupts developing democracies. So in the United States, it requires less information to establish an anonymous shell company than to obtain a library card. In other words, it is harder to check out a book from your local library down the street than to set up a company that will facilitate a Russian oligarch's money to enter our system, potentially to peddle political influence, or to allow Huawei to potentially buy political influence, or even potentially to allow, say, a Chinese state-linked company to evade sanctions on North Korea and Iran. Think about that. In the European Union, more than half of EU member states do not have full bans on foreign donations to political parties. Two, I believe it's Belgium and Denmark, and I apologize if that's wrong, but I think it's Belgium and Denmark, have no restrictions whatsoever. So a lot of the we think is illicit activity, but we know it's reprehensible, is actually, in many cases, legal. So the burden really is on us to clean up our own houses. Take, for example, the first Czech Russian bank loan to Marine Le Pen's National Front Party. That was legal according to French campaign finance laws. These rumors that are swirling about the energy money from Russia that would end up in Matteo Salvini's La Liga's hands through Eni, that, according to La Liga neutering Italian campaign finance laws earlier this year, may, if true, may have been legal. So when we think about state capture, even in developed democracies, we permit these legislative loopholes that allow this money to enter our system. So the fixes are actually fairly common sense. They don't require a lot of thought, and yet we allow this to happen. But there's another element of capture I want to talk about that I think is sort of underreported, let's say. I call it societal capture. And by this, I mean when a nation is so consumed by its own divisions that it creates all of these avenues for malign influence from abroad. And I think we've heard and seen this over the last couple of days here in Tbilisi, but we also see it in the United States, where and other developed democracies, where legitimate political and social movements are either infiltrated by or manipulated by or amplified by foreign state actors. In the United States, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement was, in some respects, hijacked by Russian trolls, where legitimate hashtags on social media were amplified by Russian trolls to the extent that they then delegitimized the use of those hashtags by legitimate actors in the Black Lives Matter movement. Or take Brexit. Like it or not, the Leave campaign was a legitimate political movement, and yet the alleged co-option of Aaron Banks through potential Russian bribery and investments in mining companies, if true, not only serves to, I would argue, delegitimize the leader of that movement, what is otherwise a legitimate movement, but also facilitates Russian geopolitical interests. So I think we have to focus also on the subversion of political and social organizations, and there's of course a corrupt financial element to many of these instances as well, especially in the case of, say, Aaron Banks. But I just want to highlight that because I think it's an element of capture that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to. Thanks.
Fabulous. Well, I'm sitting here increasingly thrilled because it seems to me we're covering a huge gamut of very important points, and there hasn't been any redundancy yet, which is quite miraculous. So I guess it's ladies last.
Thank you. Does it work? Oh, yeah, now I can hear myself. So Russia is captured by Putin. I think everyone agrees on that. It seems that in Georgia is captured by one oligarch. In Ukraine is still captured by a few oligarchs. How does it work in my country? Oligarchs control media. And you can't win elections without having access to TV. Therefore, you end up with controlling MPs. Probably not all of them, but certain factions, which then abuse state institutions for the purposes of the oligarch, but not for the purposes to serve the people of Ukraine. Oligarchs have money. Of course, they have money because they actually manipulate with the rules and they abuse, again, state institutions in order to get enormous profit out of businesses which are not real businesses. They are not creating added value. They are just like parasites on the state institutions. And what is also very important, oligarchs, they have lobbyists and they have best ever lawyers on the West. For example, Mr. Firtash, which is now sitting in Vienna for already 4 or 5 years, he's wanted by the United States. United States were investigating him for probably a decade for his close ties with organized crime, for his close ties with Russian regime, and he was caught on bribe. But Vienna, for some reason, can't find the legal way how to adhere to the international obligations and finally to extradite him to the US. And best American lawyers are being hired by Firtash to help and to avoid this extradition. And lobbyists. So, you know, it's very interesting trial was happening in the US in regards to Paul Manafort, as he was hired by the Party of Region to whitewash their reputation. And it appears that Ukrainian oligarchs, Viktor Pinchuk, Renat Akhmetov, were providing enormous amount of money to them through the shell companies in the UK, in other countries, simply to whitewash the reputation of Yanukovych, to whitewash their reputation, and to present oligarchs as someone who can be constructive, and to present crooks like Yanukovych as someone with whom it is important to talk. And to prevent the West from criticizing backslide of reforms, and prevent West actually from following this money of these oligarchs. So this is simply how the oligarchic regime works. And I agree that we in Ukraine, you in Georgia, Russians in Russia, how to do our own job, to clean up our kleptocracies and to build strong institutions. And we are doing that. Believe it, we are doing that. We work hard, and sometimes in some countries, like in Russia, people are risking their lives, but it is impossible for us to face these challenges ourselves. It is impossible because we are confronting powers, superpowers, which are buying their reputation, which are abusing the Western financial system. And here I fully agree with the previous speakers that we have to cut the fuel for this engine of kleptocracy and of the captured state. And this fuel are their dirty money, which they are hiding across the globe. And it's not only our problem in Ukraine, in Georgia, or in Russia. It is the problem of the liberal democracy, of the free world, of the EU, of the USA. Because it simply citizens, average citizens, don't get that this is really a security threat. Not to us, but to you, to the Western world. And there has to be urgent actions. There are laws, it's important to implement them. Very practical tool can be done. Finally, it is important to set up the EU body which will check the banks in each member state of the EU, how they do implement anti-money laundering laws. Now the laws exist, but the local, Cyprus for example, or Austrian authorities, they are not interested actually to go and to look into the bank accounts of their banks and to see, oh, how many billions are there from Russian shell companies associated with Russians. You probably have to check who are real owners of these companies. So this was not done, and these countries are not willing to do that. And it was only the US and US Department of Justice, who started to cutting EU banks from the access to the American dollar, which started to shake in the system. So the Latvian bank, the bank in Denmark, and the most cleanest societies in the EU, like Denmark and Sweden, number 1 or 2, I don't know, in top 5 list of Transparency International, appeared to be actually part of the corruption problem, big part of the corruption problem. And what else could be done? Actually, it is important to make help conditional. And this is what Vladislav was telling about the IMF policy, about the Western policy, at least towards Ukraine. There were clear conditionalities to Ukrainian government, which government had to do in the anti-corruption sector, in the anti-money laundering legislation, before we got funding. And these conditionalities actually helped a lot. We have some significant progress in this regard. What I also wanted to say, that it's both for our success in the countries like Georgia, Russia, Ukraine and Moldova, and for the success of the Western world, to understand and agree that corruption and dirty money, these are common problems. And they are security risks for both of us. And there are urgent actions which have to be implemented. And in regards to the cooperation between Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and finding common solutions how to build our internal institutions, we are already working. And actually, Nino, with this conference, inspired us that it is possible actually to set up the agenda, the international agenda for the entire country. So, and we are working now to run the next year the international conference in Ukraine, which will focus on the links between corruption, dirty money, and regional global security, energy, environmental risks. We will focus on this particular angle to look for the common solutions. So, there will be more details about that later, but I will stop here. I'm talking too much.
Wonderful. No, that's fine. Everybody was pretty much within their time limit. So there seems to be a strong consensus that's emerged here that this is everybody's problem, that it's a global problem. And we have talked a little bit about the U.S. and the anonymous ownership of assets in the U.S., how it's easier, more difficult to get a library card than to hide your ownership of billions of dollars of assets, which unfortunately is true. And of course, this, as many of us know, in this sort of an audience, this is a global problem. The secrecy in asset ownership is something that is provided almost all over the place, and the example of Denmark, the famous Danske Bank scandal routing through Danish Bank, through Estonia, and then ultimately being cleared through New York City is sort of the most dramatic example we've had, with $120 billion that was cleared through New York of having an unknown destination, shall we say. So I just use that example because of its magnitude, and we just happen to know about it. So we have this whole system of dirty money that's sloshing around. And it's interesting that so much emphasis has been put on that as opposed to other factors. Now, I think it was great for David to bring up also the, what one might call the cultural penetration and the extent to which our weakness, and one might almost say Western decadence. I think it was spoken about earlier today how Russia or Putin was feeding off it wasn't scraps, but whatever, of Europe. I mean, Europe's weaknesses are being picked up and fed on. So I think we've laid out the problem, and in the remaining half hour, and we will take some questions in a little while, but perhaps first the panel could address the solution sets that are possible. And Vlad got into that a little bit. I know that Brian had one or two more things to say. I think it would be very interesting to hear Jerzy move from his 3 points that I think are a very interesting framework for looking at the problem to talking about solution sets. And do we have also, is there one set of solutions? Is this something that has a cultural element to it? Do we need to think about different countries in different ways? And of course, we're going to want to talk about the underlying system of financial secrecy, I think, that everyone seems to think underpins a lot of this. So Brian, do you want to start? And then hopefully we'll get everyone on this topic, and then we will open it up to the audience. We have 20 minutes. I'm getting hand signals. Okay. So. All right, so we'll keep our comments on this then to about 10 minutes, so if you can all be very brief, okay. And then we'll be able to take a few questions after that.
And this is a work in progress. This is kind of a part of a larger project I'm working on called hybrid containment. Because I think what we're talking about here is part of this broader concept of hybrid war, which is the use of kinetic and non-kinetic means. This happens to be the non-kinetic piece we're talking about here. And I think in the Ukraine panel in the morning, I thought Svetlana Zalishuk put it really perfectly. She said this is a struggle between societies that play by the rules and societies that play with the rules. And I thought that was a very succinct and elegant way to put it. And how do we protect the societies that want to continue playing by the rules? I outlined some of the things earlier, talking about broadening the definition of national security. We need to tighten our regulatory regimes. This has also been talked about. We need stronger money laundering legislation. We need to do something about offshore. We need to, from the state of Delaware to the city of London, take a closer look at where capital comes from and what it's tied to. But a couple of other things that I haven't mentioned, and one is the need for an early warning system. We have early warning systems for terrorism, as we should. We have early warning systems for nuclear war. We have a DEFCON system, right, that goes all the way 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom, right? But we don't have an early warning system that detects potential threats to our national security through malign networks of influence. When a top operative in one of your country's main two political parties happens to be working for a Russian oligarch and is not filing his taxes and is not filing his the required disclosure of foreign bank accounts, red flags should be going up not just in the Internal Revenue Service, but in the National Security Council and in the Department of Defense and at the Department of State, because this is the beginnings of something that could someday turn into a threat to our national security. And I assure you I'm not talking about anybody specific here. But we need early warning systems that can begin to detect when these threats are going to become manifest, because they're not always immediately obviously manifest. It's similar to boiling the frog in the water. And by the time the water is boiling, the frog is dead and it's too late to jump out. So we need to institute some early warning systems. Number two, we need to look at this as an attack on our sovereignty. And there has to be punitive measures that can be used in response. Export bans, for example. If we are in a systemic conflict right now between kleptocracy land and rule of law land, if you will, it's not unlike the systemic conflict that existed between the communist world and the Western world. Well, in those days, we had something called COCOM, which forbade the sale of dual-use technology to the Soviet Union or its allies. Now, I'm not saying revive COCOM, but let's start thinking about punitive measures that can be used in retaliation for these attacks on our sovereignty. Why are we buying and selling Russian sovereign debt when the proceeds from that debt is being used to attack our sovereignty and our security? So I'm not saying we should do this right now, but we should start thinking in these terms. A SWIFT ban was actually very popular a few years ago. I actually worry about that would harm our European allies' economies. We need to turn things like snap financial exercises. This is an idea that Daniel Fried has brought up and Edward Lucas has brought up about kind of doing an exercise similar to a military exercise where we would say these are the assets we would seize and these are the bank accounts we would freeze in the event of any aggression, kinetic or non-kinetic. And finally, a PR campaign to our own publics. And I think, Daria, you got to this, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to sell this to our own publics as a national security threat. We have to be, it's hard to do because it doesn't have this kind of frightening appeal that a military threat has, but it's no less dangerous. And I was trying to explain this to a friend when I was home in Connecticut last week, explaining what it is like to live in one of these systems where they don't play by the rules, they play with the rules, and where your business can be seized at any moment by a politically connected oligarch who has the law enforcement and the judicial branch in his or her pocket. So I think this is what I've come up with so far. It's a work in progress, and I see Charlie signaling its time.
Look forward to hearing more about this, Brian. So
maybe I'll publish it in the American Interest, Charlie.
That would be wonderful. Let's very quickly, thoughts from the others. We can just go down the line since we don't have much time. Yeah.
Very quickly, I think that there should be transparency into the actual owners of companies, and I know there's legislation. Mike, this is on. Okay. There's legislation in the United States that will actually address this, and hopefully this fall it actually gets passed. I think there should be a central EU anti-money laundering body because right now the EU is only as strong as its weakest link, and over the last few years, let's be honest, it's been pretty weak. I just want to quickly elaborate or take Brian's point on early warning systems one step further. There are some nascent efforts, particularly in the EU and the G7, to establish rapid response mechanisms to address disinformation in particular. The problem is these institutions tend to look at all these threats, these threat vectors, individually as opposed to looking at them holistically. Disinformation doesn't happen in a vacuum. What happens when an information operation is combined with a cyber attack to hack and leak to discredit a legitimate political movement? What happens when there's dirty money that enters the country to co-opt that political movement or to buy off, the possibilities are endless. My point is that you can't just look at the financial issues separately from the information issues, from the cyber issues. This is a question for the EU, it's a question for NATO. I agree that NATO should be looking at financial threats. This is a national security issue. So I think it is time for individual governments and institutions to look at this challenge holistically and not in silos.
States are captured via hybrid warfare, you're suggesting. Vlad.
Thanks. If I may, also just reference to the comments, I think to judge that what you said about the three elements is excellent. I would probably add slightly the fourth one. Francis Fukuyama recently been in Kiev. He said, those who don't like institutions, they like referendums. So those who don't like institutions usually, are trying to capture the state because institutions are something which in many countries, including in Ukraine, is an obstacle to capture the state, or is accelerator to capture the state if they're weak. Yeah. So first, secondly is about the early warning system. I think it's very important. Apparently for the anti-money laundering, the banks do have it. Unfortunately using very weakly, and I fully agree on the European regulator to be done, and my understanding is, in general, there is no European banking market, it's pending, and therefore this is a problem for a single regulatory mechanism also to have it. But the early warning system, and this is, I want again to make the connection to the yesterday presentation on the fighting with fake news, if somebody would consider, the fake news attacks, which is generated narrative coming from different parts of different countries, not only from Kremlin, this could be considered as also as an early warning system. As soon as you see that there is an increasing number of messages going in one narrative, it means that there is something might be behind. So, and here I fully agree with David, is that it would be considered as an integrated approach, because most probably in parallel with these attacks, there is going incoming money and the attacks on the politics, on the society, and that's why it should be taken very seriously. And I fully agree with what Ambassador Herbst was saying, is that fighting now for Ukraine and Georgia is to be considered somehow as a cause for the security of the world, because non-liberal world, I would not say only Kremlin, but mostly in our market, is trying to undermine our countries, and they are practicing on our countries, and they are developing this further to the more liberal world in other countries, and Brexit is already one of the outcomes. And finally, here is that the system which Brian was saying, and what I was also referring, it seems as a very complicated topic, and it's very hard to break, but we discussed with Kurt Walker in Washington recently my presentation, where you can break it, you can analyze it, you can analyze by atoms the system, and as I said, behind every capture activities there are names, because the corruption has a name. As soon as you take it not as a just indefinite definition that this is a system, something which is no name, very complicated, someone whose name cannot be named, you know. As soon as you start breaking into details and attacking the parts of the system, hopefully together, you can fight with it for sure, both on our country's level, but also on other countries' level. And I think here, hopefully Ukraine and Georgia will become the best practices for other countries.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm glad you brought up institutions. I mean, actually, we could have spent a lot more time on that. And when we see state capture in action, there are always attacks on institutions that are very well thought through, and that's a very strong part of the strategy of state capture always. I should mention, everybody's always quoting Frank Fukuyama. He is chairman of the editorial board of the American Interest, which, of course, I can't neglect to mention now.
Yeah. I would like to make one simple reservation, although I very much admire what David and Brian were saying about hybrid threats. It's a very sensitive area of work also for me. But state capture and hybrid warfare is a little bit a different thing, although very strongly interlinked. So there is no doubt about this. But simply, if we specifically talk about state capture, I would prefer to focus on this. If we are talking about the sources and the elements that we can address quicker than others, I would definitely look into ourselves and especially into so-called general West. So in that sense, every single voice that was already raised to anti-money laundering or to exercise existing law, this is all true. But we should also see more into culture of operations. We should ask ourselves how many fortunes were made on the businesses with Ukrainian oligarchs, with the Russian oligarchs in the 90s in the West. There were a large group of people who were happily benefiting, knowing what they are entering, what kind of money they are dealing with, and what kind of businesses they are doing. And please remember that OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is only 30 years old, or even less than 30 years old. And in early 90s, in Belgium, you could report in your company a scholarship for the Nigerian Minister of Energy's son, scholarship funded by the company as a normal cost of operation. So our own culture of operation in business did change, but not enough to really help all those practices to be correctly implemented. So looking now how Plahotniuc was spending millions in Washington in different Lombok institutions or even research institutions, creating atmosphere that I am a good oligarch, that is pro-European oligarch for Moldova, that is good. And the same is done by many Ukrainian oligarchs. We have to be aware that our own culture of operation is not yet free from causes of the problem.
We have incentivized, what's our term again? We have incentivized state capture. Sorry.
State capture.
Yes, we are part of the problem in that sense. And actually, I think that's something to keep in mind is not just do we allow it to happen, but the mere fact that this whole system is in place is an actual incentive for people to capture states and for the wrong people to come into power in these states. And that's something I think we should be thinking about deeply. Daria, quickly, and then we'll have 5 minutes for 2 questions.
Very quickly. Solutions. So what could be done? Investigative journalists have to be supported, heavily supported, with money and with protection in all the countries where there is capture state. Law enforcement agencies on the West have to be well staffed And their work on investigating foreign corruption money laundering has to be prioritized. It exists in the US, but it doesn't exist anywhere on the level of the EU. Yeah, I will stop here.
Okay. Terrific. Well, thank you. Journalism, for that matter, is threatened everywhere in the world, including in my country in some ways, I'm afraid. But let's turn to the audience, and we will keep the questions very brief and the answers very brief, and hopefully we can fit in a few questions. But we have 6 minutes. So let's go to the gentleman in back there, and then we'll go to the lady in front.
Shall I start or?
The gentleman back there. Yeah, no, and then we'll come to...
Hello, my name is Georgi Oniani. I represent Transparency International Georgia. We're among those NGOs who signed and distributed a letter yesterday where we talk about the state capture yesterday, in this country. We started talking about that around a year ago. Then we saw that there were the just first signs of that, but the situation has really deteriorated over this 1 year. It's not that it started 1 year ago, it's just we started talking only then. Probably that was not early warning, but here we are where we are now. And my question is, how to handle the situation now when we have basically, when I was listening to all the stories which were presented, I would say that we are probably in the worst situation here because we have clearly a situation when no institution in this country can withstand the whims of this monarch, basically, because he is the richest man in the country who has 30% of the country's GDP. So how to handle this kind of situation?
Okay, great. I think we got the question. You've coined a new word, monarch, if I got that correctly. Thank you. The young lady in front, and then we'll take a third question and wrap it up with that.
Nina Labiashvili, Institute for European Studies of Tbilisi State University. Thank you for conceptualizing this phenomenon, and it has been not so long since the state of affairs in Georgia had been labeled as state capture. So my question is, what's next? What will be the effect of this labeling upon Georgia? I'm asking this question because the other side of the story is that we have been praised for many years, and even now, for being the torchbearer of promoting democracy and democratic liberal values within the country. We've been praised for being the front runner for implementation of association agenda. Association agenda is not only about trade with European Union, it's about values, it's about democracy, rule of law, and human rights. So we don't really want to feel like the boiled frogs.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, these two questions are one in a way. Who would like to take a first stab at this very quickly? We have just 3 minutes left.
Maybe I will answer to the question what we can do now just by giving you an example of my recent talk with colleagues from Armenia. We do support many civil society organizations in Armenia, and many of them were part of the protests that led to the political change in Armenia. And I had a short talk about what next. And what struck me in my discussion with them, they were all the time repeating that they are so proud that their protest and their revolution is not geopolitical. They are equally friends of Moscow and Washington or Europe and Russia. And I said, that's wonderful that you say so, but will you fight corruption? And they said, of course we will. From the moment you start fighting corruption, you're becoming geopolitical. So any moment you stop fighting against corruption, you stop identifying issues, this moment is a moment when the state capture consolidates. Every initiative that you continue and you have in place to fight, whether it's corruption or incompetence of the authorities, you are fighting state capture. So this is a permanent fight. There is no done deal. There is work that has to be continued. In that sense, simply everyone has to look into its own capacity and do whatever it's possible. And it's not lost case, but it's a difficult fight.
I mean, I will try to answer the first question, slightly the second. You know, I think the answer to this is you need to continue to be democracy and to fight for your democracy, because democratic choice will help to change it somehow. And I see some skepticism on your face, but there is nothing better and developed than democracy. And first, I would follow what Daria was saying, is develop and try to get more financing of the investigative journalists and protect investigative journalists, because, and this is what reflecting to what I said before, the system, which is supposed to be a part of the state capture, can be, you know, analyzed, can be seen. You can see how people are, how the election process is ongoing, put a lot of efforts there, a lot of monitoring, how the nominations done, please put a lot of monitoring there, a lot of information, write a lot of articles about that. Look how the government is working, how municipalities are working, put a lot of initiatives there in order to make their work more transparent. Look how the state enterprise work and how they are affected by the capturing the state or by the oligarchs. Look how the enforcement agencies are working, and again, you know, trying to highlight their job. Look how the media are working, which are owned by the oligarchs, and look how the monopolies are working. So these are 7 elements which I was telling before. So they can be further atomized, and if you have the proper, you know, democratic process, and if you have investigative journalists who can bring this information and more transparency to the society, it will help.
Okay, very quickly from Daria and Brian, and then we're wrapped up.
I'm just thinking what I would do probably. Can you hear me? No. Okay, this better. It was a surprise to me. I didn't know that a private dentist, a private bodyguard, a private, I don't know, whoever, of the oligarch now are becoming the members of the government of Georgia. It has to be told many, many times. It has to be told in English. It has to be supported with facts. 30% of Georgian GDP, I would want to see how this 30% of Georgian GDP is formally owned and formally controlled by Ivanishvili and his associates. I would want to see the network and the map of all the associates of Ivanishvili, both in Georgia and out of Georgia. I would want to see what is the source of money for Ivanishvili kids who are, as I understand, are studying in the United States. These are the weak points of the guy. He is probably living here, but he doesn't want his kids to be living here. So investigate. And the bank. He has the bank, but this bank is operating with access to the Western financial system, specifically to the US. So what is the correspondent bank of Ivanishvili Bank in the United States? Address all the facts of his violations, of Ivanishvili violations to this bank. So I think this is something that I would probably be thinking doing if I were in Georgia.
I'll be very brief. I want to answer the question about the situation is becoming critical in Georgia right now. And I agree, the situation is cause for concern of all friends of Georgia right now. But Georgia's biggest enemy isn't necessarily Russia, although Russia is a big and formidable enemy. Russia's biggest enemy, Georgia's biggest enemy is despair. And what I would say now is don't give in to despair. How much money did Solidarity have in Poland in 1988? How much media did Václav Havel have in then Czechoslovakia in 1989? Not much, but they won. They won because they're on the right side of history. So I say don't give in to despair. The civil society here is strong. The captured state looks formidable right now, or the almost captured state, or the capturing of the state, but it's not inevitable. So that, I guess that's the best I can offer, and maybe that's the way to close it out.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you all.